Hey folks, DJ here. Welcome back. This is going to be part three of Fireball simulations in Blender. If you haven't done one and two, please go do those so you know what's going on here. This is going to be on Sparks, which is basically going to be a particle simulation that follows a smoke flow, which is what we've been working on. So you're going to be able to have some really cool particle effects that will follow like what you're seeing in the images here. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so here we are inside of Blender, and just a note for everyone, I am using Blender 2.93.6, so I know some people are using 3.0, and that's great and everything. All of the stuff I'm showing you works on 3.0. I'm keeping it 2.93 for this, or at least the rest of this tutorial series, so that if anybody has any issues with OpenCL renders or whatever, you can actually finish this using 2.93. But I checked it in 3.0. Everything that I'm showing here works exactly the same. There's really no issues, so you should be able to do everything that I'm showing you how to do here in 3.0 just as well, okay? So let's go ahead and get started with creating the sparks. So if we take a look at what's been going on so far, we can see we have this really cool simulation here. And then, of course, when you turn on your noise setting here, which I'm not going to turn on, but you'll know that it does have, you know, a lot more detail than what we're seeing here. But what we want to do is we want to create a spark simulation that shoots off some particles and will follow pretty much this trail that we have created here. Now, keep in mind, this tutorial is going to be on creating the sparks. I'm going to be putting a very, simple shader on it, on the spark, so that you can kind of see what it looks like within the smoke domain. But we're going to be tackling the materials on the next tutorial. So just keep that in mind. I'm just going to show you some really quick ways to just sort of visualize it before we go into the really much more detailed materials settings. So before we do anything, let's make sure that everything here is named properly. So we have our fireball, which we're going to be using again. We're going to be using this right here. We can turn off these lights right now because we don't really need them. We have our path, which is fine. We have the smoke domain. So pretty much everything is fine. But what we're going to do is we're going to actually duplicate this fireball here. So let's hit Shift D, duplicate, and right click to set it right back where it was. And what we're going to do is we're going to rename this to Sparks. Okay, just like that. You can see that you can name it here in the object properties and up here in the tree. And what we're going to do is we're actually going to turn off this fluid setting here. So make sure you go over to the physics properties and you turn off the fluid, because we don't need any fluid to actually happen with this. But we do want to keep that shape because the spark should be flying off of a similar shape. And since we created a sort of, displacement and this subdivision here, it's just easier to follow it along there if we just duplicate that object. So there we go. It's right there following along. And what we'll do is we'll go ahead and we'll start a Sparks simulation by clicking this plus, and we'll rename this Sparks. Okay, and we can actually name this here as well. And if we take a look at this and we play it, we can just see that it's just sort of following the path, but it's falling down. So we do have to change some settings and do a couple things in order for this to actually follow our smoke domain and to go along with the particle flow, or with the fluid flow of the smoke and the fire. And before we do that, we're just going to do a couple things here to make it a little bit easier to see. So if we go down to the viewport display setting right down here, change this, actually keep this to rendered, and right here, this size, let's change this to a 0.01. Let's see. There we go. So that's more closer to what the particles will look like, which will kind of help us out. Next thing that we're going to do is you can see that the particles are sort of falling down here. Okay. So if we go down to the field weights right here, you can see that there's this thing called gravity. So there's gravity. We're going to turn that off for now because we really don't need that. So if we press play, now you can see that it's just sort of flying up in the air and, doing whatever, but it's not really following our particle flow, our smoke domain flow here. So if we then go back to the beginning and we start to add basically an effector that's going to tell the particles how to behave. So if we hit Shift A here and we go down to force field and then we go to fluid flow right here, and I like to scale this up a little bit, Control A, and I'll apply the scale, but I like to make it a little bit larger so that I can see where it's at. And what we'll do is we're going to go right here to the physics properties, and we're going to choose the domain object right here. So if you go into settings, you can change the domain object to the smoke domain. And we're not going to really play with anything else here because I want to show you what happens once we have this set. Okay. If we go back to our fireball, sparks here, actually, not the fireball, and we go to the emitter particle settings, and we press play, you can see that really there's not much going on still. So what we'll want to do is go down here to the field weights, choose our collection, and then go back and press play again. Now, what can happen, but you can see here that there is a different effect. You can see that it is following that smoke flow. But what can happen sometimes is you might not see anything change, and you might have changed some settings within your fluid field here. If that happens, all you really need to do is go into where it says emission and just change this to a 1001. Or just go up and down really quick, which will kind of reset the cache, and it will tell it to like recreate a new simulation for you. Sometimes it can get stuck in a looping simulation if nothing inside of here actually changes. So if we press play here, we can see that it does appear to be following the smoke flow, which is awesome, but it's not exactly following as closely as we'd like. So if we go back here and we click on the field, the fluid field, go to the settings, and let's just take the strength here, make it 3, flow, make it 3. Press play. You can see that once that happens, you can see that's following that smoke flow very, very closely. Okay, and it's looking pretty cool. Now there are some things that we might want to change with our particles, our sparks here. We want to sort of like reduce the amount of time that we're spending creating this thing, right? So when we start to really like cache this setting and everything with our sparks, we want to make sure that it's only caching what we're actually going to see. So what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to take the backside. I'm in edit mode. I'm going to take the backside of this wall that is sort of like a collision object. I'm going to grab it and move it on the x-axis so it goes out like that. And then if we look at it from the front view in wireframe, and let's go to here, you can see that at this point, frame 40, it appears like the ball, our fireball here, has gone into our object. So what we can actually do with the sparks here, take the end frame and change that to 60. And let's just change the lifetime to a 30. And you can see when you start doing this stuff, you'll see the particles do some weird stuff. That's okay, just go back to the beginning, press play, and now we have that going on there. And I have it set to, it looks like 10,001. It looks like I accidentally, instead of making it 1,001, I made it 10,001. So, but for you folks who have a sort of slower computer, just keep it low for now. Keep it at like 1,000 or something like that, and just kind of watch how it works. Actually, you want to change the end frame to 40 here, not 60. Let's change it to 40. That way, yeah, there we go. That looks pretty good. Now you'll notice that it doesn't actually seem to be doing much with this piece here. It just kind of goes through this wall, and then that's pretty much it. There is some effect happening if we go to the frame where it actually connects. You can see that the particles here are actually following the flow up off of what would be the wall here, but it doesn't actually appear to be doing it 100% accurately because we don't have a collision here. So let's actually change this here. Go to the physics properties, change that to a collision. And if we play this again, let it sort of play forward. There. So some of them came through just because the emitter is emitting some as it goes into the object, but that's fine. You can see here it goes right there, and boom. It's colliding off of our object here. Now it does appear that our collision object is just inside. You can see here that the fire is just inside of our collision. That's okay. We could just take the front plane here. Let's actually go to solid mode here, grab the front. grab this along the X, and we'll just move it to be about right there. And press play, see how that runs. And whoops. There we go. So it's nice, it's colliding right with that. Now, one thing that you might want to do with your sparks here is you might want to add some randomness. So we can go here to the object velocity. We can actually move this up. We can increase the randomness. We can take the normal here, which the normal and the tangent will basically just kind of like change certain things with the way that it's projecting off of our object. So you can see here that we have more, um, you have the particles kind of like kicking off of your object more than it was before, which does sometimes create a problem. It will make it to where it won't necessarily get grabbed by the fluid field. So sometimes that can happen. And what you can do at this point is we can actually go down to our physics here. We can change the Brownian, which kind of adds a little bit of sort of random jittering. Move that up to maybe a 1. And I'm also going to see what happens when I take the mass here in the physics, change it to a 0.25, which will make them sort of behave a little bit differently. You can see that now it's being grabbed more and more by the smoke, and the Brownian allows them to have a little bit of movement. And you can then again go up here to the normal. Let's change this to a 20. Let's go wild. Let's see what happens when we go back to the beginning. You can see that it's kicking off, and sometimes it causes some other weird stuff like that to happen depending on how you are setting some of these. So I do recommend that you play with some of these, the velocity and the mass here, and just sort of come up with some settings that seem to go a little bit, more of what you're looking for your Spark simulation to do. This is sort of the creative area where you can start to play with a lot of these and then break a lot of stuff. But I will say that, if you do take your fluid field and you keep it roughly here in this 3 and 3, and you don't click this apply density here, you can pretty much get it to follow along your smoke pretty well. And I would say that for the one that I have here, I would take the sparks and add a little bit of our gravity back in, maybe even 0.75, so that it has a little bit of a drift. So it can kind of fall a little bit, kind of like that, and it doesn't just stay in the air. Okay. So that can make it look kind of cool, a little bit more natural. And what we can do from there is we can actually increase the number. So let's say you go 10,000 or something like this, and you press play, and you can see that there's a lot more going on there. And it's really following the flow. Now, one thing you'll notice is that they'll start to disappear, and that's because of the lifetime right here. The lifetime is only set to a 30. So we can change this to a 40, and we can go and press play here. And you can see that it will continue to go through, and then all of a sudden, you'll see them start to disappear. Right there. You can see them start to sort of disappear there. And we are going to do some things with our shader to make this look a little bit more obvious. But what we want to do, or not obvious, but a little bit cooler than it just disappearing, okay? But what we want to do here is we want to increase some of this lifetime randomness, because if we increase the randomness, sparks in real life don't just all disappear at exactly the same time. Depending on how it's, how large they are or whatever, it can change the lifetime of how long that ember or spark is lit up. So we want to have some lifetime randomness, and we will be using the lifetime information of the particles to generate some of our materials. So you want to make sure that you have a nice setting there for that as well. So what I'm going to do here is I am going to set this to a 50,000. And then I'm going to go down here to the cache. Here we go. Sometimes I forget where these things are. And we're going to go ahead and press bake. And you can see here that as we press play, I have a whole lot more sparks going on following that path than I did before. And there are a whole bunch of them. So depending on what you want and sort of what you're looking to do with this, how much RAM your computer has and all that kind of stuff, you might want to reduce that amount. You might not want to have that many. It's really kind of dependent on what you want the simulation to look like. But this is where it's going to be at the moment. And I'm going to now show you what it kind of will look like when we start to add our materials. So what we'll do here is let's go to a good frame, something like this one right here, where we can see a lot of them sort of like within the smoke. Okay. And we're going to hit Shift A, we're going to add an icosphere. Okay. And when we add the icosphere, we want this just to be a like a really low poly number. We want, because we're going to have this duplicated where all of our particles are. Okay. So we're going to take this, we're going to make that setting a 1. You can see here that if I click this, once I add it, I can change the subdivisions. And let's scale this down to a 0.1. Control A, apply the scale. And let's just move this along the X and we'll just put it over here. And we're going to go ahead and call this, let's just call this Spark Object. Whatever makes sense to y'all. So let's then click on our sparks here, and we're going to go down to where it says render. And you can see here this says render as halo, and that's basically what these are. And you can change these. You can change it to a path, a line, an object, whatever. So we are going to render this as an object. Okay? And there's nothing selected. If you go down right here where it says object, instance object, we're going to go to the sparks object. And you can see there they are right there. And from here, we can change the scaling on this. We can change the randomness of the scale. Let's just put that at a 1, and you can see that now there's a difference in the scaling of the object throughout. And let's change the scale to something like a 0.02, something like that, because sparks are really small. At least for this simulation, I'm going to make it pretty small. Okay. And we're not going to render out the emitter. So we're going to take that off, and then in viewport display, I'm also going to take off the emitter as well, so that when we look at this in a rendered view, it is a little bit more easy to see what's going on. I'm going to also at this point turn off the fireball as far as in the viewport here, the visibility, and let's just take a look at this at the rendered view. So right now you can see that there's just little objects, okay? There's not really an emission that's happening with our sparks. So if we take the sparks object, and if we go over here, I'm actually going to save this. So let's go File, Save. We'll call this 3. If we take our sparks object and we go to the shader editor here, and we add a new material, let's actually delete the principled BSDF, and we will add an emission and put that into the surface right here. But for the emission, what we're going to do is we're going to look for a black body. So if you do F3 and search for black body, that will actually have a more realistic color, and it's all based on the temperature. So, you know, you can see here that it's nice, and it has this really cool orange color. Okay, and for the strength here, let's just put it up to 50 just so that we can see what's going on. And that's a little bit too high, but we can at least see where the sparks are. Maybe a 20, maybe a 10. Maybe a 3. So you can see there that it sort of changes over time, or it changes according to the strength here. And if we take the temperature and we move it up to like 7,700, like that, you can see that it's now white. So we are going to be doing something with the materials to make it so where that transitions according to some particle information. But before we get there, let's just put this back to 1500 and just take a look at this. So we can see that there's a lot of sparks here, and it might look kind of weird, and that's because they're just points right now. And usually when we see sparks, there's a little bit of a line that's drawn, and that's going to be that's going to basically happen once we start to put some motion blur on this. So don't worry too much about that right now. That comes more in the render phase of this project. But let's go back to the solid mode, and let's take our domain, and let's go to the settings here and turn on our noise information. So now when we do that, we can see that we now have the more detailed volume that's happening. And when we look at this in the rendered view, we get a better idea about what the smoke is going to look like. And from this point, we are going to turn back on some of the lights so we can see what's going on. They're a little bit too bright right now. So let's actually change this to, let's do a 100. And this other one here, let's do a 100. Let's see if that helps out. So there we have more of a natural sort of smoke look because it's not overly lit. But we can see where our particles are placed within there. So basically, from this point here, it's going to be up to you on just getting the particle effects to be where you want it to be, increasing the amount to what you think you might want, and changing up some of the criteria in your particle settings and in your fluid field to get it more or less where you think it feels right. And we're going to be adding some materials to both the sparks and the smoke in the next tutorial. So I look forward to seeing you all then. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you next time on DJ Tutorials.